So, I mean, when we come to talk about the Middle East, I mean, I don't think that many can argue the fact that we're talking about probably the most volatile region in the entire world, not because of recent history over the past century or 2 centuries or the such, but also because of the actual reasons or factors for dynamism, but also of conflict within the region, whether it be the riches of minerals and fossil fuel and the like, or whether it be even in terms of the human resources. You have one of the youngest sections of society across the world, probably, that are part and parcel of everyday life in the Middle East. And obviously so many issues. I mean, whether it be the Mediterranean, whether it be the issue of migration, whether it be all of these issues. I mean, they make the Middle East one of the most volatile, probably one of the richest, one of the most promising, one of the greatest potentials.
It's one of the great paradoxes of the region. You have immense wealth, vast riches, but chronic poverty on a level, that is uncomparable on a global level. I mean, this is a region where poverty is on the increase. In other parts of the world, it's decreasing. And you mentioned the Mediterranean. Well, in 2019, the BBC did a survey, and it found that young people between the ages of 18 and 29, half of them wanted to migrate. Half of them, because there are absolutely no opportunities in this part of the world.
You mentioned this, but in 2011 or 2012, a research center that was based in Germany and established an office in Baghdad did a survey of something around 6,000 or 7,000 under 35-year-olds, men and women across the religious sections, the ethnic sections and the such of Iraqi society. And over 93% said that if given the chance to leave the country, they would. And like you just said, it's such a paradox, because we're talking here about Iraq, one of the potentially richest nations in the entire world, with one of the greatest oil reserves in Czech, but unfortunately an absolute failed political system that leads its own people to wish to leave.
In the long arc of history, I mean, there should be no reason why the youth in the Middle East should want to leave the region. The region, as we know, has been the engine for economic growth around the world. Without Middle Eastern oil, there would be no economic growth, which we've enjoyed in the West, and including China. China is the biggest importer of Middle Eastern oil. So China has elevated 700 million of its own citizens from poverty to middle class income. It wouldn't have been able to do that without Saudi oil, Middle Eastern oil. So it has enough money. It has enough money to feed its own population, to lift them from poverty and provide the basic needs. I mean, but politically, it's not been able to create the right kind of arrangement to allow for that, where the focus and the goal is the citizens, is the populations and the people that are under your control in your territory. Until that mindset gets changed, and in an arrangement where politicians feel responsibility towards people who are under their control and domination and sovereignty, you're not going to have that change.
When we talk about politics, and I'm pretty sure that we're going to agree on this, I mean, obviously the wrong kind of politics, I mean, essentially that we're talking about. But are we talking about ingrown politics that are local, that have failed to realize the potentials, or are we talking about the kind of international global politics that sees this area as an area that simply cannot be let free of their clutches for the very reasons that you mentioned?
We're speaking about both of them. The local politics, in a sense, without doubt, has failed the people of the region. And that's primarily because of corruption. You would have, Tunisia is a classic case under Ben Ali, where, over 100 companies that were linked to his family had siphoned off over 20% of the national wealth. So in a situation like that, it's no wonder why you have, why the region is the only region in the world where that tops the list of unemployment. For the last 25 years, the Middle East has been at the top of the countries with unemployment. And as you said, there's vast riches, human, over 300 million people, but 65% of them are living in abject poverty.
I mean, just look at Saudi Arabia, for example. It's the modern day gold rush, you can say, in terms of the amount of money the Vision 2030 is willing to invest, trillions and trillions of dollars. Who is employing? It's mainly Western, experts and consultant companies. Why doesn't it have a population which is dying to have these jobs and lift themselves up from poverty to
Absolutely.
middle class and on a different scale in society?
It's one of I guess. I mean, when you look at so you have the case of Saudi Arabia, and it's well publicized. We all know about the mega projects. We all know about the sort of Vision 2030 that the Crown Prince has espoused and is working towards. And regardless of the controversies within, whether it be ideological, religious, ethical, whatever, but as you put it, I mean, if we looked at the mere economic, it just simply does not make sense that a single Saudi citizen is hovering around the poverty line, let alone over 25% of the population. It doesn't make sense that there is a single Saudi family that don't actually own their house outright, when in fact it's only 22 to 23% of the Saudi population who own their house outright. So that's fine. But again, if we're looking further afield, countries like Algeria, I grew up reading about Algeria being one of the most important oil producing nations in the world. But you look at its reality, the reality of Algerian youngsters, thousands of whom every single year try their best to flee from across the Mediterranean, put themselves and their lives in harm's way, in hope of reaching the promised land of Europe, which in itself is seeing a recession. So, I mean, the disparity between reality and between the sort of theory or theoretical potential is incredible.
One thing I want to mention here, and I think Nassim touched on it, the whole involvement of China, and it's the development that it made over the last decades. And since 2004, because I'm mentioning this because, at the end of last year when Xi Jinping came to the Middle East and the big summit and so on, there was a big, hoo-ha about the whole thing. The truth is, China and the Middle East has been involved for over 6 decades. And in 2004, they formed something called the China Arab States Cooperation Foundation, where the Chinese have benefited.
Absolutely.
They have invested in the region, and they have but what have our people in the region gained? That's the problem. And and a lot of the agreements that were made, was about human resource, human development training, scientific training, research, etc. We're not seeing that being translated on the ground, and I think, despite these agreements, looking forward, we have to ensure that the people of the region benefits from these agreements, not just the Chinese, not just the Russians. It's not on.
Following on from that, the reason why money does not remain within the country and does not serve the population within those countries is partly because it's what's in politics known as rentier states. Countries like Saudi Arabia, many other countries in the region, I think every single one you could say, within the global system, they're more like a rentier states. They serve the purpose of other countries. Saudi oil, for example.
Was this by design, or was there a mistake that's happened somewhere at the very top, and then it just basically incrementally went off tangent? I mean, this is something that often bothers me. because, I mean, there are those who might argue that this was by design, this was deliberate. Where we are today isn't by virtue of a mistake that's happened somewhere along the line. This was the plan from the very, very start, that the riches that are flowing from these countries, for these nations and the such, they are flowing for the benefit of others. And those that say, actually, it was a misstep, we didn't have the political foresight, we didn't have the economic acumen, we didn't have the shrewdness that the multinational companies had at the very start, and therefore we signed on contracts that assured that only a dot of a percentage of the nation actually benefit from these riches when the entire nation didn't.
That is true to our point. And we can say that the last half a century, from the 1950s onwards, that was the case where American hegemony really enforced policies that ensured it benefited at the expense of the people of the region. But I think there are signs that things are changing in this regard, and look, yes, in terms of having a greater control over the resources, and particularly the oil, because they recognize that the world is moving in a direction where we want to lessen our dependency on fossil fuels. And what the leaders in the region, the Saudis and the Emiratis in particular, and the Qataris to some extent, they recognize now that they have to benefit now before this whole thing is scaled back. So and one of the reasons why it happened was because the United States, for almost a decade between 2009 and 2020, they began to pump what the shale oil, which undermined the prices of oil, for the Middle Eastern producers. So they woke up to the reality that the Americans were undermining them. So what they did in 2016, they brought Russia into OPEC and formed the OPEC Plus. Russia and 11 other oil-producing countries to protect their interests. All they have is this oil. So I think in that sense, it's positive. It gives us hope that the days when America would dictate are coming to an end, and people in the region are waking up that it's time to have a greater control over their resources.
Also, in recent memory, although it's been 12 years, but we had the advent of people rising against the political structures. And that coined, whether rightly or wrongly, the Arab Spring, remains to be one of the most remarkable advents of the past 50 years across the world, I would argue, where out of the blue, out of nothing, in a country as small as Tunisia, which very few people talk about, managed through peaceful protest to change change its leadership. Let's not go further and say the political structure, because evidently it didn't. But that was a big thing, especially that you're talking about someone, just like you described, that was siphoning over many years almost 20% of the country's GDP, and a brutal system that is followed by Egypt, and followed by advents in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, in various other countries, that actually showed that there was the people had an issue that they wanted to pursue, and there was sufficient awareness, there was sufficient understanding, maturity of thinking, probably, to see that there needed to be radical change, but not along the lines that had long been proposed by extremist groups such as Al-Qaeda and Daesh and the like, by virtue of using force and violence, but by peaceful protest. It was remarkable. It was something that showed the actual potential, I would suggest. The economic potential we can put figures to, But this potential you can't really numerate. You can't really put a value on and say, well, this is worth, a couple of trillion, because it's invaluable and it's there.
It's in the cultural memory now. It's in the memory of the inhabitants of that region that we can, if we tried, rise up and change the system, change the arrangement. But I think the verdict is still out on how historically that would manifest. Will, in the end, the Middle Eastern countries have a transparent government, democracy, and all those things they aspire to? In the short term, I just think, for a lot of people around the world, not just the Middle East, around the world, they look at the West now at the moment and look at democratic structures, and I think they see that a lot of these countries are failing. Democracy has produced Trump, it's produced Johnson, it's produced now at the moment. You look at the world in Europe, Bolsonaro. So they're looking at it. In the past, you could beat the Arabs with the democracy stick, and say Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East. But look, is it really? Look at your democracy. Look at your US now. Look at the economic problems you're facing here in Europe as well. So I think a lot of Arab leaders now, they actually can claim that your system's failed, and the verdict is still out on democracy. Our system's working
by the way,
fine.
They use
our
that.
system's working. We've managed to contain democracy in the form of the Arab Spring, and we're working fine. We're progressing. We have amazing economic visions, and we have amazing projects in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia. Egypt wants to do something similar. So the story they're telling is that, look, the West is really failing, which is partly why they can maintain and preserve their relation with Russia, with China, and they're still on the fence when it comes to Ukraine. Because they can sell that story that we have a political system that has found its feet. Yes, we may have been too close to the Americans before, but it's not the case. We are nationalists. We will defend our country. We will defend our nation and our traditions. And they're selling that story
it's quite interesting you mentioned this, because a few weeks back there was a BBC report about the incredibly long waiting list for A&E. How patients were waiting for days, with heart conditions, with severe and quite, critical health, life-threatening conditions, waiting in hospital corridors, and someone tells me that was picked up by the regime in Damascus, and they were showing this and saying, "See, there you go. That's the West." So all those who are pursuing their dreams of heading over to the West, this is what the West has to offer. It's killing off its own. People are suffering and such. It's farcical to some extent, but it's also it has a little bit of reality, because the West is actually failing. I mean, if you look at democracy, you could argue that democracy, and I'm a promoter of democracy. I wish that we had democratic systems. But often those democratic systems fall in the wrong hands. And at this moment of time, we're seeing across Europe that through democracy, we're seeing the rise of far-right and racist, fascist.
Well, Hitler came to power through democracy, let's say. And not that I don't want democracy. I'm just saying the possibilities of various extreme forms of government is always there.
I mean, we had in America, we had Trump. And I would suggest that those 4 years of Trump dealt a blow to the concept of democracy like nothing else, because it was the argument against a democratic election that ultimately speaking you're going to end up with someone like Trump. But let's come back to the Middle East and talk about this change that you talked about, Dawood. One of the things that came to mind as you were talking about this new shift, global shift away from fossil fuel and the like, that when the Americans called upon the Saudis just basically said no.
Yeah, they said, in October 2022, the Saudis decided to cut production. Yeah. And the Americans said, please don't, and
The people are suffering,
the
man.
price went up from $76 a barrel to 91, and the Saudis, they stuck to their guns. They said, no, we're going ahead. But by that time, now the Russians were involved. The Russians were part of the whole thing. And so the White House was saying that you Saudis, you siding with Russia against us, and they were quite upset. But
what does this tell us? Does it mean that America is less relevant to the region than it used to be? Does it mean that maybe, and I'm going to bring in one of the events that have marked the past year and a bit, like nothing else, which is the Ukrainian war. Is it at all possible or conceivable that whilst militarily the Russians haven't made the kind of wins or gains that they were hoping for or they were threatening to make, but they have made incredible gains strategically, economically, in terms of their reach within a region that was monopolized by American hegemony in the past?
Absolutely. Because if you remember, when we go back to the 1980s, the Saudis and the Americans were hand in glove against the Russians, against the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was the big shaitan, the spread of communism. They didn't want communism in the region. But things have changed. And it's not ideological. It's not that the Saudis espouse the same ideology as the Russians. It's about bread and butter issues. It's about the oil. It's about, their standard of living, and they want to protect it. And I think what happened, in the 2 decades before, after 9/11, the Americans squandered their money and their assets in Afghanistan and Iraq. They squandered it badly. They lost credibility. They lost their assets and their credibility. And now they they created a situation where the unipolar, international system that we knew before, that is changing today. That is changing rapidly, and you see new powers emerging from the south, from the global south, as well as from the north. Russia is coming back, China is there. So the Pax America is over. The era of in the Middle East as globally.
In some ways, that was inevitable because America and the Middle East was kind of a strange alliance ideologically anyway. The only reason for US being there and having as much influence it did is because, of course, its dependence on oil in the past, and of course Israel's security is paramount. It still is, but there really isn't another argument for the US to be there. And now we're seeing with the war in Ukraine, why many of the Middle Eastern countries prefer to do business with the Russians and the Chinese, because all these years they'll be told, sort out your human rights, where's your democracy? So yes, they'll be doing business with the Saudis and the Middle Eastern countries, but they will also be humiliated somewhat. What are you doing about human rights? And there's all this condemnation and criticism, and no one wants that. And I think what you're seeing now is a departure from that, where they see a better fit in terms of political model with the Chinese, with the Russians, and they're happy to do business with the Chinese and the Russians. And if they can just provide security and sell them arms and weapons, they don't really need the Americans. If the security threat is taken away from Iran, and from their point of view, from the Islamists, as they call them, they really don't need the Americans.
But I don't think, Nassim, that they would turn their backs on the Americans entirely, or go against them and challenge them.
I don't think they can afford to.
They wouldn't do that.
Yeah, no, that's right.
It's a question of, putting hanging their bets, where the interests are. If they're going to get some interest, some benefit from the Chinese or from the Russians, they will do that. But I don't think it's a question of going against the Americans.
Definitely, you're right there. I don't think they will, partly also because the Middle East loves American culture. They don't want Chinese culture. They don't want Russian culture. They consume American culture from food, from the movies they watch. They speak English many as well. So, no, they will not completely divorce from the Middle East. But I think they want to find they want to be in a position, in an arrangement where they can be authoritarian as they like. They don't want that condemnation. And at the same time, continue with their alliance, economic alliance with Russia and with China. But I don't think that can be maintained for too long, because the way the war is going, I think America will say, this is the red line.
Well,
You have to stop,
let's see. I think one of the litmus test on this is the 5G issue. What's that company, the high-tech
Hawaii.
Yeah, I need the Americans banned, the Canadians banned them, the Europeans, and the Saudis went and signed a memorandum of understanding with them. So, because they want the technology. So far, the Americans have not taken any action, neither the Europeans. Let's see if, how far the Saudis will go on this. But
it's like playing political chicken and seeing who blinks first. Yeah. But let's, obviously, when we're talking about the Middle East and we're talking about the political realities, I think that few can argue against the fact that we have three main powers that provide the markers of shifting elements or dynamics or the such. Obviously, we have Iran, and you mentioned Iran, and we have Turkey, and we also have Israel. Those three elements, I think, are quite important to understand exactly what are their aspirations and how far are they prepared to go in order to realize those aspirations. Let's talk about Iran for starts. Obviously, the Saudis will make a huge thing about Iranian threats. Threats, whether they be political, whether they be expansionist, whether they be ideological, whether they be economic. They'll make a big thing about.
Not just the Saudis, the entire Arab League.
Absolutely. Obviously, the farcical part of that is that amongst the biggest trade partners of Iran happen to be members of the Arab League itself, such as the United Arab Emirates and the like. But still, what does Iran want?
It's influence. It's to spread its influence in the region.
Is it an ideological project? Or is it a mere political project that has the guise of ideology?
Well, at its core, it's an ideology, isn't it? It's not simply we're a country, we just want to sustain our economy and our population. It is an ideology at its core, just as America is an ideology at its core. At its core is the idea of democracy and trying to spread democracy and human rights claims around the world.
According to its own vision.
It's gone to wars in the name of democracy and whatnot, democracy promotion. Iran, likewise, I think it's at its core, it's not just a country, it's an ideology, and it wants to spread its ideology. Like any ideology, it wants to have a military to back it, to spread and advance its influence around the region. So it's no different to any other Soviet, for example. The communists, states are based on communist ideologies. And when you have a state like that, then of course, if you want to spread that, then you are going to do that, because your whole raison d'etre is to exist as a communist country, spread their ideology. Your whole raison d'etre as an American is to not just be a country, but also spread your ideas. Iran is of that mold. It's not simply Bangladesh, let's just survive, we want to also do something more than that, which is to spread our ideas.
So it's in Syria, it's in Iraq, it's in Lebanon, it's in Yemen. It supports some of the Palestinian factions.
It's in Central Africa, by the way. Iran spread in Nigeria and Chad and Mali and the such.
But that has created, unease in the region. Because their role in Yemen, has disturbed the Saudis. The Houthis, if you remember, in 2019, they sent missiles against some key strategic installations in Saudi Arabia. Exactly. And the argument was that they used the Iranian missiles to do this. So that's why the Arab League has said, well, both Iran and Turkey have been intervening in Arab affairs in a very dangerous manner. And
how have Turkey? Are they referring to Turkey's incursions into North Syria and
northern Iraq also,
Iraq, right.
But also Libya? And if you remember, after the fall of Gaddafi, Turkey was supporting the Islamist government in the GNA for several years in Libya, whereas Sisi in Egypt was supporting after. So that was a recipe for what? For tension, for confrontation, and they only now trying to get over it. But I think one of the interesting things that's happening in the last year or two is that these non-Arab states, or powers, if we may say, Iran, Israel, Turkey, have been trying to reconcile, with their neighbors. The Iranians, they've been talking to the Saudis. 5 rounds of talks in Baghdad, and they want an agreement. But on what terms? The Turks also, they trying to mend friends with Sisi. They want to mend friends with Bashar al-Assad. So the trend, it appears, is that there's a movement towards de-escalation, of the tensions and the conflicts in the region, and to have a more peaceful region, as it were. I think that the problem, however, is with Israel. Why do I say that? Because what they want is a military alliance against Iran. They're talking about a Middle East NATO, and none of these states are interested.
Am I wrong in thinking that no one seems to have the appetite for that, apart from Israel?
The risk is too great. The risk,
I know for a fact that Israel has been calling on the Americans to do something about Iran militarily for nigh on now 13, 14 years. And there hasn't been a movement. And is it because the Americans have, let's say, learned a lesson in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and, as you put it, squandered their riches and resources on those 2 failed experiments, so that now they're more thoughtful when it comes to considering a military act? Or is it that Iran is no Afghanistan? Iran is no Iraq. Iran is a totally complex system that has, under the international embargo, managed to develop nuclear capacities.
And now it's forging military relations with Russia, and cooperation with Russia. It's trying to buy Russian air defense systems. This is going to change the dynamics in the region in terms of any potential attack on Iran, and not to mention, of course, its other proxies in the region, whether it's Lebanon or Yemen or whatever. So I think their position is quite important. It's significant, and
but coming back to Israel, I mean, we know that every few weeks Israel does an incursion in either Syria or Lebanon or the such,
it's partly able to, because I think Russia turns a blind eye. But I think from what's happening at the moment, I don't think Russia's going to be willing to turn a blind eye if Israel allies completely with the Ukrainians. So that's an interesting development that's taking place. And I think, as we've been saying, Israel's maximalist position when it comes to Iran is what's causing a lot of the tension there. I think most of the countries in the region, since the explosion of the Arab Spring, they just want to return to some kind of normalcy. Let's just see if we can get along, and for at least a decade or so, just have economic ties, economic relations, and try and prosper as much as we can. And peace is best for everybody. Everybody wants to do that. But I think Israel generally just feels, it cannot exist in a region where Iran is safe. I think until it climbs down from its maximalist position of wanting to have some kind of a defense coalition against Iran, you're not going to, you're going to see continuous tension. That's what's going to be for a long time.
We had 2-3 years ago, we had a huge move towards normalization with Israel. We had the UAE, Bahrain, we had Morocco, Sudan. Is it correct of me to say that we've seen that a lull in that particular wave over the past year or so?
Well, I think that the big prize for the Israelis is the Saudis. They really want to get the Saudis on board, and every now and then they put out something to say, well, this person met this Saudi official and so on.
And we have Saudis who are singing the praise of Israel and reciting the national anthem off heart. And,
well, I mean, if you remember last year, it was in the summer, the Saudis opened their airspace to all civilian aircrafts. And then Biden said, this is a significant step, a move towards normalization. And the Saudis said, not at all. This is not about normalization. This is about, our decision to open our space to all, civil aircrafts. We don't know what's happening behind the scenes yet. It's still, very opaque. But in this regard, the Omanis also opened the airspace to the Israelis. So, but I think for the Israelis, their main prize is the Saudis. Once they get the Saudis on board, this is going to give a greater sense of legitimacy and, approval, if we may say, to the whole normalization project.
And they're singing that tune all the time, saying once we have normalization with the Saudis, the Arab-Israeli conflict is finished, is over.
That's going to be the declaration that this is.
But looking into that normalization, though, I mean, if you think there was a poll done recently, the overwhelming majority of Arab countries, the population, they're not for the normalization. Yes, the regimes are, the countries are.
During the World Cup.
And we saw the solidarity with the Palestinians. So yes, again, another indication that, there's a huge gap
disparity between
the rulers and the people on the ground. And also the normalization, which way is it? You've got, let's take UAE, for example. A lot of Israelis go to the UAE and you get this image, a UAE is so open and they're doing business with Israelis, and they are to some extent. But to be honest, UAEs don't go down. There's no reciprocation whatsoever. So until the Palestinian issue is resolved, there is no way the Arab population, the Muslim population around the world, or any human being with any kind of decency around the world will say, okay, just go ahead, as though there's no issue to resolve when it comes to Israel.
So let's talk a little about Palestine. Obviously we have the reality that we have a far-right government now in Tel Aviv. And at the same time, we have internal strife, because that's highlighting more the split within Israeli society itself, where it's seeing itself. As someone put it, there's a moral question. Now, that moral question might be for activists like us three, for instance, has been there for a very long time, since day one of the Nakba. But for young Israelis now, it's posing a real problem. Who represents them? Who speaks for them? Who decides on the incursions that are now happening virtually on a daily basis into Palestinian cities and towns? The spread of settlements, illegal according to international law. How is that affecting the status of Israel and its ability to achieve its end goal? And also, how is it being impacted either by the Russian-Ukrainian war, the Iranian expansionist, project, as we call this, within Lebanon, within Syria, which are on Israel's borders, as well as the various economic up and down turns across the world, which Israel relies heavily on, especially the United States. How do we read Israel within all those factors?
I think the contradictions are becoming more apparent as the days go by, and it stems from the nature of the system. The political system never produces a majority government. Always have, they've had about 5 governments in the last...
It's always teetering on the brink.
And so we had Netanyahu coming into power and having to, go into alliance with these far-right settlers from the West Bank in order to become the prime minister. And he's beholden towards them right now. But if you look at the demonstrations that have been taking place in the country, in Tel Aviv over the last months or 2 months, it shows us that there is a significant split down the middle of this country. People who are, vehemently opposed to the settlement project, and what they represent today, because, they are Kahanists, they're not just far right, they are Kahanists, people who believe, supremacists, who believe
in wiping out the Palestinians.
Exactly, as they say. And not everyone in Israel espouse that view. So they split down the middle. And the fear is, and it's coming from the intelligence agencies, from Shebak, and the intelligence officers, people at the top, that this country, can very well go down the route of a civil war. That's the danger. It's so split, and the divide is so profound that they're saying we can have a civil war here.
Is it right also that this is also mirrored in terms of global opinion? I mean, we are seeing a greater contingency or constituency that is opposed to Israel, that is critical of Israel. And we saw this, whether it be last year in Tel Aviv.
This week, Jewish News headline, pogrom. That was the headline, pogrom. Can you imagine a Jewish pro-Israeli newspaper having pogrom in response to settlers, torching cars and destroying Palestinian houses? So that shows a huge shift. And it's often said, Israel rests on three pillars. One is the support it gets from its Jewish communities in the diaspora, a foreign patron, Britain first, then Israel, and divisions within the Arab world. And okay, put aside the Arab world, but the other two definitely are crumbling. Well, maybe crumbling to some extent, but definitely the diaspora, the support from the Jewish communities in the diaspora, that's wavering considerably, especially in the US. If you look at the US, who are mainly liberal Jewish communities, they are embarrassed by Israel. Israel is basically losing support every single day.
But the government is still firmly committed.
Yeah, the government is committed, but at least the other plank where, as I mentioned, the three planks of Israel's preservation, which includes the support of the Jewish communities in the diaspora, that's wavering. I mean, I would never have imagined Jewish News to have a headline called pogrom as a result of...
I was reading a few months ago someone talking about the waning support for Israel within the younger generations that are emerging in London and Chicago and the like around the world, and how parents are struggling to embark, the very same principles and the absolute support for Israel, regardless right or wrong, in their kids who are mixing with their peers, who are on the internet, who are seeing all these discussions, and also affected and impacted by the scenes that are coming straight from settlements and from Palestinian towns and cities.
Yesterday's protests, they were shouting Israel is an apartheid state. Yeah. These are Israelis in Israel saying Israel is an apartheid state, something which will get you expelled here in the UK from the Labour Party if you were to say that. So I think generally there's a real gap between Israel in the perceptions of Western politicians here in the West and Israel as it is on the ground, the way it's experienced by the Palestinians and also now many Israelis who don't see Israel as a democracy, they see it as an apartheid state. Palestinians, of course, see it as a settler, colonial, apartheid, racist state. But in the imaginations of Western governments, there's a real gap. It only exists in the imagination. Oh, it's the only democracy in the world. It requires our survival. We need to support it because of what happens in the past. But I think that image is slowly crumbling, and they're seeing Israel for what it really is through the extremist right-wing governments.
And maybe that's one of the reasons why we are seeing more brutality on part of the Israeli authorities. We're seeing direct action and total disregard for the cameras that are all around the place. And they are, how many clips have we seen over the past 24 months of direct, shooting, a blank point of shooting Palestinians and such?
They enjoy impunity, that's the bottom line, and supported also by the whole, normalization project. They feel that, it has been written into law in treaty. When Biden went to Jerusalem last year, he signed an agreement, a strategic security agreement with Israel called the Jerusalem Declaration, in which he promised to oppose any diplomatic and legal attempts by Palestine to hold Israel to account for its human rights abuses. Imagine, he signed that. So whether it's in the UN or whether it's in the ICC, they're going to oppose it. It doesn't matter whether it's a close range, point blank shooting of a 15-year-old. They're going to oppose it. So they enjoy that. And then on top of that, now you have states normalizing relations as if Israel is a normal state. It's not a normal state, but they're going ahead with this, this project, and that encourages them, makes them feel that, they are accepted, they're part of the region, part of the fabric of the region, and it's business as usual.
But on the other side, we're seeing also a rise in Palestinian, I would say, steadfastness, formidability. It's something that's, I have to say, is incredibly impressive. Impressive even to people, friends of mine, who were sort of on the fence. And would sort of mildly support Israel, generally speaking, thinking that the Palestinians are the troublemakers in this scenario. The likes of Al-Kurd and the likes of other English-speaking people, very presentable to Instagram and to TikTok and the like, all of a sudden have their own fan base, and they're conveying a message that was virtually absent, 20, 25 years ago. Now that message is prominent. And that message is often seen as probably even more effective than the narratives being put forward by the Israeli ambassador to London or to Washington, or wherever they may be. And that, I think, is creating... Now, I wouldn't dare say an equilibrium, because there is no equilibrium in this case. I mean, we're talking about the Palestinians who don't have an armed forces, who don't have an intelligence, who don't have the weapons, who don't have the means to merely defend themselves. But an equilibrium in terms of reaching out to public opinion. I would venture a guess and say that in the past 2 or 3 major incursions, whether it be in Al-Aqsa or Quds or that on the PR point, Israel lost. So are we seeing some sort of shift in terms of how the world is seeing Palestine, how the world is seeing Palestinian resistance to Israeli brutality?
One of the things that's really highlighted with the Ukrainian war, we know, is the double standards. But more important than that, I think it's really undermined Western democracies and their claim to uphold international law. And that's because of their inaction and policies in Palestine. People see Western policy in Ukraine through the lens of Palestine. So just their perseverance and their sumud, as we know, their determination, resistance, is in keeping the Palestinian issue alive. They have exposed the hypocrisy and the double standards. And that, in the long run, I think a lot of these Western governments realize, if you go on social media, the number of people are saying, well, what about Palestine? What about Palestine? So on top of that, you've got the COVID issue as well, which has also put doubt into citizens and civilians in Western governments. So one of the reasons why democracy is in peril around the world is partly because people have lost trust in their government. Why have they lost the trust in their government? Because you're failing when it comes to Palestinian issues. I mean, I remember 10 years ago at an EU meeting, I asked that same question to EU representatives saying, your inaction in Palestine, don't you fear that in the future, your civilians will look at you and say, look, you guys are failing. You're not the one, you're failing to uphold the very law which you say, you uphold. And as a result, you lose all legitimacy. And he said, yes, that threat is always there. But we now see the consequence of that. The consequence of years and decades of failing to uphold international law is that you've undermined the very democratic structure and fabric which you've built over many, many centuries. And the Palestinian issue has done that. They've shown the hypocrisy and the double standards. Because at the end of the day, parliaments, governments stand on a story. The story is that we are free, we are upholding democracy, we are upholding your rights, we are defending you, and we are for the rule of law. That's the story. So, but if that story crumbles by simply looking at Palestine, people start doubting you. And then on top of that, you bring doubts through the way you handle other disasters like COVID. Then you have a whole population, they lose trust. And the consequence of losing trust
that's quite important.
Is the destruction of democracy.
I mean, that's extremely important. And I think that all of us who've been following this have noted how over the past 2 to 3 years, particularly in the United States, when any word of criticism against Israel would never, ever be heard, all of a sudden we're hearing quite loud voices in Congress. And, it's and on media, on the mainstream media, whether it be the CNN or CBS or Fox or the such, where people are coming on and saying, giving the perspective that was never, ever allowed any kind of air or space before then. So let me try to, from all of this, what do we expect to happen for the next 3-4 years? We're not looking into a crystal ball here, but based on the facts that we have, based on the kind of dynamics that we have, obviously there are outstanding issues like the Ukrainian war, how that will pan out, for how long that will continue, and what kind of reach it'll have. Will it go beyond the borders of Ukraine? Will it reach into Central Europe? The economic crisis, the recession that we were threatened was going to be one of the worst in living memory. Various other, about China, for instance, and how China will make its move. Obviously, we haven't spoken enough about China, but its reach across Asia, all the way into Central Africa, through its new Silk Road, as they put it, well into territory, Arab, Muslim, territory, Pakistan, Afghanistan, the Gulf region and the such, all the way across Saudi Arabia and Yemen into South Africa. That kind of reach. All of these put together, what should we be looking at? What should we be focusing on to see what kind of real dynamics, real changing stuff will be happening in the next few years?
I think what we're going to see is that internally in the region, there is a shift. Traditionally, the power base was in Egypt and the Levant, Syria and Lebanon. So that has changed or changing. So the Gulf states are becoming more influential through their money, their economics, their political power. Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia, they will play a more, dynamic leadership role, influential role in the region. And Egypt is bankrupt, it's not doing much really. So that I think we're going to see, unfolding more and more. I think we should also watch at the trends towards de-escalation. But there are clear obstacles. I'll give you an example. The Turks and the Egyptians, they have a problem, not only in Libya, but for the energy resources of the Eastern Mediterranean. And the Egyptians, they signed an agreement with the Greeks. In as much as Turkey wants to de-escalate and to have some agreement with Egypt, I see this Eastern Mediterranean energy problem as a stumbling block. So that might not go forward. And there is mistrust in Syria. The Syrians are not ready. They're going along with it because the Russians want them to do it, but they're doing it reluctantly. The global influence, I think Russia and China, their influence is growing in the region. There's no doubt about it. Because of the perception that America has withdrawn or is retreating from the region, focusing on the Pacific. And that perception, it created a sort of vacuum, or opportunities for Russia and China to advance their interests. But the crux of the matter is that the people of the region are not benefiting from these relationships with China. There was a free trade agreement as early as 2004 with the Gulf states. What have they got? Nothing to show. It's still in its primary stages. It hasn't developed. So the international relationships, alliances, in as much as they appear to be changing, we're not seeing it trickling down on the ground in the region. Palestine, and I stop here. The whole thing about the premise of the American policy in the region is to have a Middle East peace that excludes Palestine. It brings in Israel, we settle the regional, dispute with the Israelis, but the whole thing about Palestine is, that is not going to happen. They could pay Mahmoud Abbas as much money as they want, but without a political solution, it's not going forward. And I think that's the mistake that they're making. They think that as long as they pump money into the PA in Ramallah, then things would be, would be dandy, would be fine. We've seen it right now. What's happening in the West Bank? It's an escalating uprising, an intifada in the making. So that's the future. I think there is an intifada in the making. Some argue that it has already started.
Well, just to add to that, I think we will see the completion of the rehabilitation of Assad. That's probably going to happen anytime soon. I expect the war in Yemen to finish. The big issue for me would be, will the will the Americans put a red line when it comes to Saudi's relation with the Chinese and the Russians? That's going to be a big story. And how the Saudis react to that, given that the Europeans need their oil more than ever before, Gulf oil, given they don't get oil from Russia anymore. On Palestine, I think the genie's out of the bottle. Israel, as many of us thought, extreme settler colonial fascist, has shown its colors, and that genie has come out of the bottle. You're not going to put that back in. If they were to try and put that back in, I think there will be a civil war in Israel. Settlers are 1 million. 1 million settlers armed. Israel has made it, passed a law giving license to settlers to make it easy for them to carry arms. So these are armed settlers, and to stop ongoing settlements, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. So the interesting thing will be how much longer can European governments continue to support what looks like clearly a fascist government? How long will they do that?